predators that got dealt with in prison, man. Let's rock.
Child predators don't just face justice in the courtroom. Behind bars, they meet a different kind of reckoning. These men thought they could
He said a
escape the
different
full weight
kind.
of their crimes, but what awaited them in
What?
prison was far worse than any sentence a judge could hand down. Inmates don't forgive, and for those who harm children, prison can become a death sentence. Today, we're exposing the brutal fate of four predators who learned the hard way that in prison, your
He
past
said
can
they
kill
learned
you.
the hard way,
Leonard
boy.
Nelson. Leonard Nelson, a 28-year-old man serving a 4-year sentence for aggravated burglary and the sexual exploitation of a minor, thought his worst days were behind him when he was sentenced to just 4 years in prison. But what he didn't know was that stepping into that cell was the beginning of his darkest chapter. Nelson's crimes were disturbing, particularly because they involved videos of two minors imitating sexual acts, with Nelson's voice in the background instructing them on what to do. The defense tried to argue that Nelson was mentally impaired, claiming that he had the mind of an 8-year-old child. Family members, including his aunt, pleaded for leniency on these grounds, but the evidence was damning, and the court found Nelson guilty. Once incarcerated, Nelson was placed in a facility that catered to inmates prone to misbehavior. It was a place where troubled individuals were kept under closer watch, but even in such a controlled environment, the dangers of prison life are ever present. In June 2016, just when it seemed Nelson might serve his time and move on, he was found dead in his cell. At first glance, prison officials
Damn, they got
believed
on
it to
his
be a suicide,
ass.
given the stigma attached to his crimes and the
I thought they
mental
was
health
gonna give him
issues his
buck
defense
50,
had
you know,
previously
take that
highlighted.
nigga,
It
you
wouldn't
know
have
what
been
I'm saying?
surprising if Nelson had
Damn,
taken his own
they
life,
just
but
knocked him
this
off.
initial assessment quickly changed when the extent of his injuries became apparent. Nelson's head and neck bore signs of trauma that were inconsistent with a self-inflicted death, prompting an investigation that would soon lead authorities to Nelson's cellmate,
Damn, they
Daniel Smith.
strangled
Smith
for.
was serving a 5-year sentence for aggravated burglary and theft of property. He wasn't known for violent tendencies that could lead to murder, but once questioned, Smith confessed to the killing, revealing that the two had gotten into a scuffle after an argument. The exact details of what sparked the fight are unclear, but in the confined and volatile environment of a prison cell, it didn't take much to push someone over the edge. The specifics of how Smith carried out the murder were never fully disclosed. Reports didn't reveal the weapon used, if any, or the exact method of the killing, but the outcome was clear. Nelson was dead, and Smith was now facing even more time behind bars. Robert Munger. Up next is Robert Munger, a criminal whose fate was sealed long before he even stepped into his cell. After all, when you commit crimes as heinous as his, there's no escaping the judgment that waits. Munger, a 70-year-old, was convicted of multiple counts of child molestation and child pornography, crimes that had devastated numerous young
Sick
lives.
ass
The court
man.
handed him a 43-year
That's a sick
sentence,
ass man.
effectively condemning him to spend the rest of his life in prison.
Special
Upon his
spot in
arrival at
hell
the
for
Airway
you,
Heights Correctional Center in
special.
Washington State, Munger was assigned a cell with a younger inmate named Shane
Your ass
Goldsby.
got a
At
penthouse
first
on
glance,
there,
this
boy.
might have seemed like a routine pairing, but there was a dark connection between the two men that would soon lead to tragedy. Unbeknownst to the prison officials, Goldsby's younger sister was one of Munger's victims. Imagine being forced to live in close quarters with the person who had caused so much pain to your family. That
Oh,
was
they
the
knew.
situation Goldsby found himself
They
in,
knew.
day in and day out. Munger, apparently unfazed by the potential danger, would reportedly taunt Goldsby, recounting the details of the abuse he had inflicted on Goldsby's sister. Goldsby later described how the tension inside him kept building. He was trapped, not just physically, but emotionally. Despite making requests to be moved to a different cell, Goldsby's pleas were ignored. As expected, in June 2020,
No, they
Goldsby
wanted that
finally
nigga
snapped.
knocked
He
off.
attacked Munger in their shared cell, striking him repeatedly in the head. The violence was relentless. Goldsby didn't stop until Munger was dead. By the time correctional officers intervened, the damage had been done. Goldsby was quickly charged with first-degree murder and received an additional 25-year sentence on top of the time he was already serving.
That's
However,
worth it,
during
though.
his sentencing, he expressed deep
Hell
regret for
yeah.
his
Finna
actions,
do them
not
25.
just for the murder itself, but for the pain
Shit
it caused
show.
Munger's family. David Oseas Ramirez. When criminals are sentenced to life behind bars, they're supposed to be off the streets and out of the public's reach. But for some, like David Ramirez, life in prison can be more dangerous than freedom ever was. Ramirez, 56, was arrested for a crime that shocked and horrified the community: the lewd and lascivious molestation of an 11-year-old girl. The crime was heinous, and the evidence against him was overwhelming. So, his trial in 2013 was swift. with the jury taking just 15 minutes to return a guilty verdict. The gravity of his
Damn.
crime led to a
That's
life
how you
sentence
know you did
inside the
that shit.
Duval County Jail, a punishment that many believed was deserved given the nature of his offense. On July 30th, 2019, however, the dark reality of prison life caught up with Ramirez in the most brutal way imaginable. His cellmate, Paul Dixon, a man with a violent past, had been serving time
His last name Dixon. This could go left. This could go left. I'm
for
gonna,
first-degree
I'm gonna let
murder,
it
among
continue.
other serious charges. Dixon was no stranger to violence, having been convicted at just 17 for a murder that put him behind bars for life. The combination of Ramirez's history and Dixon's propensity for brutality was a recipe for disaster. The tension between Ramirez and Dixon began with a verbal altercation, the details of which remain unclear, but what is known is that it soon turned physical. Dixon, driven by a mix of anger and disdain, attacked Ramirez in their cell. The assault was brutal. Ramirez was beaten severely, and then, in a final act of violence, Dixon forced his head into the cell's toilet, drowning him. When prison authorities arrived, they
Damn.
found Ramirez dead. The scene was grim, and
Gave
the
his
cause
ass
of
the
death
final
was immediately
swirly.
apparent. Dixon, who had nothing to lose, was promptly charged with second-degree murder for the killing. But within the walls of Duval County Jail, Dixon's actions were likely met with silent approval by other inmates who viewed Ramirez's death as a form of prison justice. Clinton Simpson. Last but not least is Clinton Don Simpson, who in 2018 met a violent end in a jail cell that left everyone stunned, from his fellow inmates to the guards who found his lifeless body. Once a preacher at the Brown Trail Church of Christ in Bedford, Texas, Simpson was a man who held a position of trust in his community. But behind the facade of a caring community leader, Simpson harbored a dark and sinister secret. He was the owner of Mr. Don's Whistle Stop, a miniature train complex he had built on his property. For years, this whimsical attraction drew children to his home for birthday parties and other events. Unfortunately, this seemingly innocent setup became a nightmare for many families. In 2007, Simpson's world came crashing down when the parents of a young girl reported that he had molested their toddler daughter during one of these train rides. This report opened the floodgates, leading to
On
the
the
discovery
train?
that Simpson had allegedly molested at least a dozen children over the years. The accusations were severe, ranging from aggravated sexual assault to indecency with a child. It was a shocking revelation for the community, one that left many in disbelief. Simpson's legal journey was long and complex.
I would have
His
killed him
attorneys
before he
repeatedly
even got to
argued that he
jail.
was
I'm
not
not gonna lie.
competent to stand trial, citing mental health issues. This led to years of Simpson being in and out of state hospitals for evaluations. The legal battle dragged on, with many hoping for justice, while Simpson's competency was continually questioned. It wasn't
That
until
boy wouldn't
2018
even
that he was
made it to
finally declared
jail,
fit
bro.
to stand trial and was moved to the Tarrant County
Like, I
Jail in
probably just
Texas.
would have put
Inmates
these
often
to his
have
ass.
their
I'm
own
not
code
gonna
of
lie to you.
conduct, and
You
those who
touching
harm
kids, you
children
got
are
to
at the
go.
very bottom of the hierarchy.
Oh,
So Simpson, now 76 years old and in a wheelchair, became a prime target. On November 7th, 2018, he
he
was
been a
placed in
prime
a
target.
cell with David Faustino Flores, a 42-year-old inmate with a history of mental health issues. Flores had been incarcerated for assaulting an elderly person, a crime he claimed he committed because he believed the man was a member of Al-Qaeda. Flores had also previously informed jail officials that he suffered from schizophrenia and had a history of hearing voices. He even requested to be placed in a separate cell, citing his inability to handle being around other people. However, this request was ignored, and Flores was placed in the same cell as Simpson. What happened next was a gruesome and tragic sequence of events. Flores claimed that he began hearing voices, including those of his deceased mother and God, telling him that Simpson was Osama bin Laden and that he needed to kill him. In a frenzied attack, Flores repeatedly bashed Simpson's head into the floor, continuing even after Simpson fell out of his wheelchair. The assault was so brutal that it left Simpson with part of his skull caved in. He
That's
was
that
rushed to
karma for
John
your
Peter
ass.
Smith Hospital but succumbed to his
He ain't even
injuries
kill you
shortly
because of what you
after.
did.
If you
He just
enjoyed this
fucked you
video,
over
you
on
should
some
click
other
on the
shit.
ones displayed on your screen to enjoy more content.
Bro, we finna cut it right there, boy. I'm glad some of these motherfuckers got it. That's if they really did what they said they did. It's over with. J3 be out.